Hi, I'm Andy Schmuckler. Uh, it's the day after Thanksgiving here. Yesterday, I had occasion to tell a few of my favorite Jewish jokes, um, and they got me thinking. Did I wanted to make a video about my favorite Jewish jokes, and I've got about five of them, and I got some things to say about them, and they get laughs generally. Um, and then I got to thinking about these times. First of all, there's been rising anti-Semitism in general over the past I don't know few years. Uh, it's probably connected with rising fascism in this country and elsewhere. But and then there's this Israeli Hamas thing, which I've made videos about before, which is uh, really intensified uh, the anti-Semitic feeling in the world, where um, I think times more acts of violence of an anti-Semitic nature in the United States than there was in a comparable period a year ago, or something like that. There are statistics about this, and demonstrations that are against the Israeli policy, but also contain other elements that can be readily seen, um, and have been disturbing. Uh, so I was thinking, do I really want to go public telling Jewish jokes? I have Jewish ancestries. The Nazis would have killed me if I'd only had one Jewish grandparent, and I got four. So, I qualify as Jewish in that respect. Um, and that's part of my identity. Uh, I have other parts, an American, a human being. That's really not a trivial. That's stronger for me actually than um, either of the others. Um, but it is an important part of me because I got brought up in a family in which the Jewish culture out of that came out of the West, especially out of Eastern Europe, being a part of the West, was what I imbibed. Having my mom as a mom and having my dad as a dad was being cooked in the or marinated in the marinade of that culture, and just as people who are a couple generations removed from Ireland um, are you can see the way the culture has moved through time. I mean, that's who all of us are, and that's an important part of who I am, as well as being an American boy who got into, Major League Baseball, listening to every game, and getting into Davy Crockett when that came out in the, from Disney in the early '50s. I don't remember if I bought a coonskin hat, but I did buy the only 45 I ever bought was the Ballad of Davy Crockett, which I learned all the words to. I only remember clearly the first stanza. Maybe I can blow that one too. But anyway, I'm an American boy, and I'm Jewish. And I thought that maybe I would talk about how I see this all because, here I am, a man in my 70s, had always been thinking about stuff, and certainly anti-Semitism and the nature of Jewish culture and the Jewish religion. By the way, the Jewish religion doesn't float my boat. Though I love the, I mean, like particularly the book of Genesis, all those stories. My favorite book that I've read in a long, long time is a book called The Beginning of Wisdom, about the book of Genesis. And it goes through, our Garden of Eden and Noah and the Tower of Babel and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and ends up with, you know, Joseph being a big deal in Egypt, where by the next book they'll all be slaves. I mean, these are great stories, and I love those stories, and I learned them from Hollywood as well as from going to any kind of religious education. But I don't. My belief system is not founded on the I believe in one God thing. And my sense of the human story is separate, but has often been in dialogue with, Genesis offers a way of understanding the origin of evil, and I like juxtaposing that with its different, more evolutionary way of understanding it. But yeah, so I have a relationship with all that, but it's not as a believer, and ritualist observances just doesn't float my spiritual boat. So that's the kind of Jewish guy I am. Yes, in a meaningful way, having to do with the culture, ways of thinking, and stuff like that. No, not in religious terms, though. Both the Jewish and Christian traditions are deep in my understanding of how people have struggled with the questions that I think we need to be answering, and have offered some valuable things that, I love the idea of love thy neighbor as thyself. I think that really puts, the challenge right out there, at least do unto others, the Christian tradition. Um, and also the idea that there are things that thou shalt not do is, a pretty important concept, which I, also observe, but I don't see them as being handed down on stone tablets on Mount Sinai. So that tells you a little bit of who I am, and the only reason I think the reason I'm talking about this is that we're living right now in a somewhat troubled time around the issue of Jewishness, and maybe a guy like me could say some things which are both interesting and maybe help put all this into a kind of a clear view, at least pieces of a clear view. And one of the things that I do talk radio, or I did talk radio out here in a very conservative part of Virginia, in the Shenandoah Valley. And I've occasionally, and now I write op-ed pieces, which I send out to this piece of, it's part of the Bible Belt, actually. And it's also Trump country. But anyway, I occasionally will tell the conservatives whom I'm addressing with my radio or op-ed voice that liberals are just as good people as conservatives. I've been in a position, when I was saying this back in the 90s on the radio, I was in a pretty good position to know. I really appreciated a lot of the people that I lived among, the conservatives, the traditionalists of this rural area. And I also had lived a lot of my life in relation to, liberal culture and around university towns or even in the Bay Area of California and then inside the Washington Beltway. So I could tell him, you see sort of a similar amount of virtue and defect in either side of that divide. And my impression is that this is a larger truth. And I wouldn't want to go so far as to say every single category is just as good as every other single category, but I know Jewish and Christian American worlds, and as far as I can see, and in the Jewish world, from the secular to the Orthodox, as far as I can see, there are comparable levels of virtue and defect in all the different groups that one sees. Not that there aren't any differences. I mean, everybody's got their cultures and their ways of organizing life. Whether you're a Catholic that goes to mass or you're a Jew that observes Shabbos, there are different things and the different teachings and different emphases. And culture all over the world is doing that, and this is just a part of it. And sometimes I think it's hard to make these comparisons. I think some human worlds have been more traumatized and wounded and broken than others. But everybody seems to be working to generate the structures that allow them to live a good life and also that reflect the wounds that history has inflicted. And I think about the Irish, I think about the Sicilians, and I think about the English, and I think about the Catholics, and I think about the Protestants, and I think about the Jews and the Muslims, and what goes on in Hindu India, and and the Confucians and all that. I'm not real inclined to rank them. I mean, I have some feelings about some sacred texts that don't seem as sacred to me as others. But basically, I think human beings are striving in their way to make the best of what they can with what they got dealt, including situations that are difficult in a world that is broken. And they come out with a mixture of things that represent the human good and things that channel destructiveness through the human world. And that's how it looks like to me. Now, there are things that I particularly, let me just stop and say, anti-Semitism is almost always based on something which is really false. The Jews in the Middle Ages didn't kill Christian kids to get their blood to make matzah for Passover. But a whole lot of slaughters of Jews took place on the belief that it did. And I just read a headline where apparently in a case, in a case involving a Christian family, a Jewish family not wanting the public schools to compel their children to participate in Christian prayers in the public school. About that, a Republican who is now Speaker of the House, Mike McCarthy, said that the purpose of the enemy is to silence the gospel. That wasn't the purpose. Obviously, that wasn't the purpose of the Jewish families. Any Christian should know that if you believe in do unto others as you would have them do unto you, you wouldn't want your kids, as if you're a fundamentalist Christian, to be compelled to participate in Islamic prayers. So Jesus taught in the gospel, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But this right-wing thing that often proves so welcoming of anti-Semitic views, it's called that family the enemy for bringing suit to say that the Supreme Court should find that the public schools should not be in the business of promoting one religion and imposing it on everybody else. So you end up with this sort of fundamental lie, where on the one hand, perfectly human beings are saying, don't make my kids do this. Meanwhile, the broken side of the religion is calling that person the enemy rather than dealing with them according to the gospel, and saying that the enemy is the enemy of the gospel. Now, the gospel told him, don't do unto other people what you would not have them do unto you. The people who slaughtered the people in that synagogue in Pittsburgh had bought some conspiracy theories that are basically just false. I mean, that's not what goes on. I mean, the protocols of the elders of Zion was the tool by which the idea that the Jews were this evil force trying to take over the world, according to this thing, is just completely discredited, and it's still out there. There's something about the lie and anti-Semitism, which it raises all kinds of important questions. We can talk about what Jewishness means, but or at least to me. But there's also the anti-Semitism aspect, which raises all kinds of questions that I'm not sure we got adequate answers to, about why a group of people would have a lot of energy for buying into a kind of conspiracy theory in which this group of people is a fundamental threat that warrants slaughtering them. There's something not real good about the state of mind that would make that rewarding. That where the need for that kind of an enemy, who's not up to anything like that, to be a major part of what you see when you look around the world, and then to act on what you see in a way which has led over the centuries to massacres. The Holocaust wasn't the first time that Jews died in great numbers because of the anti-Semitism. I've wondered over the years just why the Jews, and this is what I think is basically the belief. There have been societies in which being different has been experienced as threatening. And we can talk about why that is, and that is an important question. But in the Europe of Christendom, being different wasn't really tolerated. There was, at least in the West, there was one church, and anybody who deviated from that church was a heretic. There's just the religious persecutions were possible and happened even within the Christian world. Being different was not okay. Everybody had to sign on to the same thing. And that's a major sign of distress in a civilization. But there's no lack of signs of distress. And meanwhile, the Jews were this people that were distinctive in how they have created a culture that allowed it to pass through history, like a seed through some bird or other, to get dropped in different places and still being intact as a seed for that culture. There are a variety of ways that Jews accomplish this, and that's a topic that I've also given thought to. Some of which kind of turn me off, but others of which I have great respect for. But in any event, um, if you go back 2,000 years, and you look around the world, you'll see there are all kinds of groups that existed in that world that was more fragmented, uh, that did not survive into these times. Uh, you go back 4,000 years even, and you can see that there have been huge diversity in cultures. And over time, and this is what my book, The Parable of Tribes, basically talks about, which is the war of all against all, and the ways in which weaker cultures are continually destroyed one way or another by stronger cultures. So it's remarkable that there's anything really continuous with what there was 2,000 years ago when the Romans drove them out of out of Palestine because they were such a pain in the ass. This revolt and that revolt, the Romans found them revolting. So, pardon me, I like playing with words. So, it was really a lot of bloodshed at that time. I mean, the Bar Kokhba revolt, the self-immolation of the last remnant in Masada. I mean, this is a history of a people that were determined not to be destroyed, and the diaspora began. But Jewish culture created these ways of keeping themselves separate. Like, here's one. A child has to have a Jewish mother to be Jewish. So that means if the father goes out like a merchant and he goes around and let's say he produces offspring on the side, they are not part of the tribe. We do not have blurry boundaries. The women who stay inside the Jewish community, if they bear a child, we make them one of us. It keeps it pure. The culture perpetuates itself and doesn't dissipate. And then dietary rules also keep people apart. And I think that is actually their purpose. And I don't much care for that. Yet it led to this incredible achievement that a people that were basically driven off in all directions, existing in the Arab world, existing as far as India, existing in Spain eventually, and Holland, and all over the world, that somehow they perpetuated what they were. That was a culture that was without the accoutrements of power, but they could continue to be a people one way or another. And if you're existing in a world where being different isn't okay, you're going to be in for a rough time. So I think that the Jews were probably, I think for the most part, you can say that the Jews were the only people in that position in Western civilization. That's approximately true. So you have centuries for the Jew to become the object of whatever it is that people who live in a society where being different isn't okay will imagine you to be. I mean, when Michelangelo did that wonderful statue of Moses, I mean, it's kind of a trip to think of it. Even Michelangelo, who's creating this beautiful figure of the giver of the Jewish law, has horns. I mean, the culture was more or less permeated in this imagery, which would result in that statue having horns, which I imagine connects with the belief that the Jews and Satan were in some kind of a league. Not like the Bush leagues, but in on the same side in some way. So that makes it easy for there to be, and I don't really know the circumstances. I mean, for example, the Jews get kicked out of England around the time of the Magna Carta, I think. There's stuff about it in Ivanhoe. Elizabeth Taylor is this beautiful Jewish girl. I mean, she was so gorgeous at that age. And you know, the whole thing has got to do with the persecution of the Jews and with the oppression of the Anglo-Saxons by the Normans. And I got off on a tangent, but something happens that leads to the expulsion of the Jews, and I'm not sure what it was. And then in 1492, with the Inquisition going on, which tells you that if there's going to be anti-Semitism, it's connected with the same spirit that gives you the Inquisition, which was pretty ugly form that Christendom ever took. So you have the Jews told either convert, leave, or be exterminated. And a lot of them convert or pretend to convert, but the Jews are driven out of Spain. And you've got the Crusades and the people who think that what they should do is leave their country and go back to the Holy Land and drive the infidel out of the Holy Land. That they think that that's what their business on the planet is to get rid of the infidel. And not to give their sacred territory be dominated by the people who live in the region. They, massacre Jews along the way, and what that's about. So, anti-Semitism is really just. I mean, you can find fault with Jews. You can find fault with, the downside of any people you want to name. You can find people who embody something which the culture engenders. But we're as good a people as any. My family had its issues, but it had its beauties too. So on the anti-Semite side, that's just the culture having generated over centuries a form that its brokenness could take. Racism of white over black is another one of those kinds of forms. But even, when the Protestants arose, there were 100 years of religious wars because the idea that you could respect other people who were different had not taken hold. That was a form of brokenness in the civilized world. But on the Jewish side, and why I'm really I cherish my Jewish identity. I mean, I can identify aspects of it that I don't cherish. There's a kind of difficulty. Like the idea if there are jokes about the quarrelsomeness of Jews. You can point to defects that take a particular form in Jewish culture that either are not the defects you find in the other cultures or take a slightly different form. But what I most cherish about the Jewish culture are a couple of the process of conversation that's been going on in this cultural system that's moving through the centuries like a seed that doesn't get like you can go into an ancient pyramid and take out the grains of wheat from 3,000 years ago and plant them, and they still grow. I mean, that kind of thing. They did it in part by they did it in part by the rituals I got no use for. But they also did it in part by having this long conversation about what does this mean and what does that mean and how do we reconcile this and how do we reconcile that, and developing a whole intellectual culture that's pursuing the truth using certain kinds of tools. So they become people of the book and people of the law and people of logic and people of the interpretations of texts. And then the use of, you end up with somebody like Freud many years later who interprets texts of a different kind. But he draws upon that same cultural system, which looked at the written word again and again and again and had all these discussions about what did it mean. And here's Freud interpreting the dream as a text, or the Freudian slip as a text. It's kind of remarkable how many of the people who have developed valuable intellectual structures that we have in our culture in terms of how do we understand the human world. How many of them are biological descendants of the Jewish culture that was moving through the world by maintaining, weaving a system of belief and a discussion that they put to use. I mean, all the great Jewish thinkers that include not only Freud, but Marx, and I think Durkheim, and a lot of others. I mean, they're not all of them, not Max Weber, not Charles Darwin, but there's a whole body of work that grows out of, and I see my dad and what he put me through at the dinner table. You know, if I would say something, I'd make some kind of an assertion. He would put me through my paces. Critical thinking, you know. Well, what do you say about this argument? You know, what's the evidence for that proposition you've said? And, you know, I see myself as being the recipient of a river of thought that fed into him and then feeds into me. And I dare say I've fed it into my kids. That's the way cultures work. And I really appreciate that. There's one other aspect of Jewishness, which is, well, there's more than one other. I want to add that if you look at some of the people who have represented the values of justice and social action, and you know, the two white boys with the black boy who got murdered in Mississippi in 1964 or whatever, the Mississippi burning episode. Two of them were Jewish. Saul Alinsky in Chicago, organizing the powerless to be able to protect themselves from being exploited by the powerful. There is that dimension that runs deep in the Jewish culture. And I feel like both my parents communicated that. And there's one other thing, and I was once on a massage table, which I got body work on a regular basis for decades. I'd be even tighter if I hadn't. And I had this moment of envisionment or something like, you know, not through a rational means, but sort of envisioning myself as being like a river of the prophetic that's been a part of Jewish culture. You know, the books of the prophets. You know, you start with, you know, people like Samuel and Isaiah, and John the Baptist is another one of them. And there are people who speak as vehicles for the voice of God. Now, I myself don't know what I'm the voice of, but I feel like something like that. You know, I haven't figured it out. I mean, I'd love to have, you know, I've had moments where I sort of thought I saw myself as the good son of God the Father in some way, and I love that feeling, but I can't get there, not for the most part. Oh, pretty much not. And so, but mostly they're people who speak moral truth to amoral power. And let's see, yeah, that, no, I got it wrong again. That is a work of a prophet, of prophecy, saying, um, this is where the sacred lies. This is where we are off the right track. Um, and then in the last 20 years, seeing the force of fascism rising on the right and getting up as a blogger and then as a candidate for Congress and as an op-ed writer in this conservative Trumpy area to talk about, um, the battle between good and evil. Uh, calling upon people to withdraw their support because it is their support that is threatening the good with the power of the evil. You know, the prophets spoke about evil, whether they were chastising the people for not taking good care of the widows and the orphans, or whether they were like John the Baptist, they were accusing him of sexual crimes and otherwise, or whether they were Amos accusing the corrupt, cruel king and his evil wife of violations of God's law. Um, they were all taking the position of standing up and speaking for what's sacred and denouncing what's broken. And when I do what I do, I really think that what I do is an expression of a cultural stream that was flowing through the centuries, through the generations, within the Jewish culture. And so when my grandparents, my mom tells it as if her family was more religious than I understood they were when I was growing up. I don't know what they were. But my father's family was definitely not religious, and none of it. That even if they weren't doing that, they were expressing their culture because that's who they were. They were the products of these little villages that were under the rule of the Tsar, but were also expressions of a Jewish culture that had formed in some way that produced a fairly unique thing, and it produces some stuff that's kind of impressive. I think about Israel, for example. Don't get me involved with Netanyahu, and I mean he's so bright and he's such a sociopath. I'm very unhappy, but there's a certain pride in looking how this little Israel is a heavyweight in the high tech world. There are these minds that have been formed so that they're able to do a lot of innovative things in the sciences and technology and like that. And the disproportionate number, there are strengths, and I try not to embody the defects of my culture, my Jewish culture. There's a book about Yiddish that I've got called Borga Kvetch, Kvetch meaning to complain. And, I know that part of myself, and that's not what I want to manifest in the world. But the culture has also helped me develop certain things I like, and things that I'm happy to utilize to the best of my ability to help the world become a better place. I would like, if I could have a couple wishes about me and my Jewishness, what would change. The first thing is that the Israel, the world's one Jewish state, would become governed by the best elements of their nature. And those best elements had a lot of uh, power in shaping Israel. I think there's a lot that's marvelous about Israel. Uh, and that I, I don't know that there's any reason why it can't be a wonderful country again, including how they deal with the Palestinians. Though I am fully aware that they face huge challenges, even if they were completely enlightened and completely moral and wise, it would still be a challenge to get to the two-state solution where both sides are living happily and securely side by side. Yet, I see no reason why Israel can't move in the direction of becoming the society that is best able to do that. And they are not that right now with this Netanyahu government. So that's one thing. And I also would like, especially it's painful right now to look at all the hatred of Jews that's running around the world. I don't know how much of it is there because of of all the people dying in Hamas. I think there's a whole lot that's there because it's there ready to be, like when it gets too dry or too humid, the mold forms or something like that. But anyway, I would like for the world to stop hating Jews. It's not good for anybody. Certainly not for the Jews, but really not anybody. And for the Jews to be putting out their best into the world, which can be really some great achievements, and the world welcoming it. That's what I'd like to see. Lamb lie down with the lion, or whatever that line is in the Old Testament, the prophet's vision of the world that we might have. The Jews are a people with a lot to offer, and they also are in need of a lot of healing. I feel really, really fortunate, given that I'm Jewish, that I lived in a world that didn't require me to heal a whole lot from it. I mean, I think my grandmother on my mother's side went through a pogrom, and there's stories it's of horror. And my brother and I have talked about how my mother's stories brought that home to us early on. My brother thinks that she should never have told those stories. I don't feel that way. I mean, I feel like it's part of me, and I'm okay with it. But we've also talked about epigenetic. It means that there's some kind of Lamarckian evolutionary things. There are ways in which experiences can affect the expression of genes into the first and second generations. So the Holocaust survivors are not who they would be if their parents hadn't gone through the Holocaust. And I don't mean, they mean even how their genes are expressing, and all the way to the grandchildren. And we are the grandchildren of somebody who went through a pogrom. And my brother and I entertained the idea that part of what we are, which feels like we've absorbed something painful, is actually at that level, and through word of mouth and through the culture. And anyway, I would like to see the traumas of history being something that the Jews could recover from. The Israelis have just suffered a huge new trauma. And I don't know how that's going to ramify for them, but we basically need them to be healing. The Holocaust played a big role in giving birth to Israel. There's an Israeli film called Walk on Water. It's a beautiful, wonderful film about this kind of brokenness and about forgiveness and healing. It sort of moves me to think about what it's about. But there's a lot of trauma in that part of the world. It would be so wonderful if the Jews could heal from their trauma and the Palestinians could heal from their trauma, and the world become a place where people even at the level of nations love their neighbors as themselves. So that's an ideal. And it was a Jewish rabbi who was born in Bethlehem and raised in Nazareth who said, love thy neighbor as thyself. And when he was asked, what did you mean by that? Who's the neighbor that we're supposed to love as ourselves? He chose us to tell a story in which the neighbor to love was the person from the other side of some big boundary, the person from the despised group. The Good Samaritan, I mean, I didn't know this for a very long time, but the Good Samaritan, it doesn't mean like they're named after a nice hospital. It turns out that between the people that Jesus is talking to and the Samaritans, the people that Jesus is talking to despise the Samaritans. And so he's saying, love even the people you despised as yourselves. We are all human beings. We all would be better and feel better in a world in which people did love each other as themselves. So I think that Jewish rabbi put out a very good recipe for building the human world we need. Anyway, thank you for listening. I will come back and tell some Jewish jokes now that you know who I am with respect to all this stuff. When I was a kid, all the great singers were Italians. You know, Dean Martin, Frank Sinatra, Perry Como, Tony Bennett. They're all Italians. And all the comics were Jews. Milton Berle, Phil Silvers, Jack Benny, Henny Youngman. That's before my time, actually. But it was the two cultures were both the children of immigrants, and the Italians had brought this wonderful singing culture over, and the Jews had developed this great humor culture. Well, I'll be back and tell some Jewish jokes, not those comics jokes like who was that lady I saw you with last night, not that stuff, but some actual stories that I love and what they show about, about humor and about culture and about how people seek the truth in a world where there's so much that's not true, that's true that it doesn't get said. Okay, be back. Bye-bye.